Hey everybody, I'm Dr. Erin.
I'm Dr. Kristen.
You are so very welcome to our Cuba 101 video as a part of our Colonizers World Tour. We're on Spanish colonies. And as we always start these videos, we start with what we knew about Cuba prior to commencing research. I knew quite a bit about Cuba, but it was mostly through the lens of US involvement, I will say. So obviously we're taught about Castro and the Bay of Pigs and Guantanamo Bay. I like Cuban food. We tried Cuban food very recently. Well, not tried, we ate Cuban food very recently in New York City. I like it. I learned a lot about the Spanish-American War through our other focuses on the Philippines and Puerto Rico and Guam, which we got all of those properties in the Spanish-American War, but that started with the Cuban-Spanish War. And when we covered Angola, I learned that they intervened there, which was one of the weirder things we learned about Angola, but it was cool. So mostly like military stuff, political stuff, not a whole lot of culture. Dr. K, what about you?
I mean, obviously, through the repeated watching of the very accurate documentary, Dirty Dancing, Havana Nights.
Havana Nights.
I learned a lot, just kidding. Although, fun fact for everybody listening, NPR's Peter Sagal actually wrote the original script for Dirty Dancing Havana Nights, but he wrote it as a revolution movie, and then he sold it, and by the time it made it to the screen, it was Dirty Dancing Havana Nights. Like, okay, Hollywood's fun.
I love it.
Yes, I mean, same with you, like military stuff. Obviously I lived through the 2000s, so the Gitmo of it all, and remember Obama's campaign promise to shut down Gitmo, I think it was. And we have actually a flag here in our office that was flown over Gitmo at one point when it was still open, because our company attorney is a former JAG officer. So like that kind of stuff. But love Cuban food, have met Cuban people, love several Cuban Americans, but never as in-depth as this. And so definitely as everything with Colonizers World Tour is, I mean, gosh, just the best opportunity to learn about things that aren't me. And I'm always grateful for it. But in case you're like us and your point of reference is a Dirty Dancing sequel that was middling at best, let's head to the map. So in terms of geography, you may or may not be aware, it's an island. It's the largest island in the Caribbean, and it is not only one island. This is one of my fun Jeopardy facts we'll get back to later, but it's also made of several archipelagos and islands around it, which I did not know. It is between the Caribbean Sea and the North Atlantic Ocean. It kind of lives there. It's only 150 kilometers south of Key West, which is the southernmost point of the United States, which is why we get one of the reasons we get a lot of people fleeing Cuba on boats to get to America is that 150 kilometers is not actually that far, but in the open waters of the Caribbean, it is not joking around either. So all of that to be said, the population's right now around 11 million. Capital is Havana, or Havana, depending on which Camila Cabello song you were listening to at the time. The language absolutely is Spanish, but like everywhere, the dialect, there is a specific Cubano dialect, and there's proper Spanish and spoken Spanish, all those kind of other malarkeys, just like there is English. Now, let's get into the ethnic indigenous stuff. Ooh, buddy, is this a whole lot of like, question marks, lots of people telling you lots of different things. No one really kind of agrees on how we talk about this in some ways. So according to the census, 64% of people identify as white, 26.6% identify as mulatto or mixed, and around 9% identify as Black, and this is in 2012. This is the self-identification. This is important because while we very much like to judge race visually, entirely by the level of melanin in someone's skin, it is also an inherent identity that people get to choose for themselves on some level. White people don't get to choose to be Black because they happen to, really like Ethiopia, Rachel Dolezal, but we kind of get to, lines get blurred. So we need to say that to the extent, we'll get into this in a little bit, but there's also a massive history of slavery on this island. and the way that race works in Cuba. There's lots and lots of links about it in our living Google Doc that you'll find, is very different from the United States. And they make the point that it's because the US has the 1 drop rule, where if you have 1 drop of African blood in you anywhere, according to the United States Constitution, you are considered a Black person. That rule doesn't exist in any other country, from what I can tell. And so the relationship between races and in racial identity is slightly different. And that's an important thing to keep in mind. Now, currency, fun topic, because the economy is always a fun topic with Cuba. So they have 2, and really like 3, depending on what part of the island you're on, from what we hear. So the convertible peso, which is the CUC, is used mostly by tourists and is entirely tied to the American dollar. I know from friends that have gone there that you can also use pounds, euros, and dollars in Cuba. They'll figure something out. So there's that. Then you have the Cuban peso, which is used in the state sector and is worth about 24 times less. And this is very much a hangover from the USSR. So you get 1 US dollar to 1 Cuban peso, not convertible peso. Really happy that they didn't choose 2 different letters there, folks. Thanks so much for that. And before 1984, when the Soviet bloc really 94, when the Soviet bloc collapsed, they obviously were very tied to the Soviet bloc. The US dollar was outlawed. I am sure it still existed because that's how the world works. But it was technically outlawed and all that kind of other stuff. Okay, and here's just like, let's call a spade here. There's one political party. It is the Cuban Communist Party. It has been that way for many a year.
A long time.
It will probably be that way for many a year.
A long time.
However, there's a fascinating video in the show notes about how elections work in a one-party system, which I was fascinated by because I've never lived in a one-party system. So that was highly recommended. Yeah. Final note on LAMAP. We need to talk about religion. So like 60% of people are Catholic. Then we've got folk religion, Buddhism, Hinduism, a whole bunch of other stuff. Here's where my little religion scholar goes, because like you have the very Latin American understanding of Catholicism, but then we have the illegality of religion according to the Communist Party. So what this actually looks like, just like in our last actually couple videos that we've talked about this, how this actually has to look is utterly fascinating. And I did not find heretofore enough data to where I really feel like I have a good grasp on what religion looks like on the ground in Cuba, but I'm still searching. If you have resources around actual lived religion in Cuba, I'd be fascinated and deeply in your debt if you would provide them. Now, we talked about currency, which means we got to talk about the economy.
Lord,
what's the crack?
Lord have mercy. Yeah, the economy is fascinating, as we have discovered in a lot of our journeys around the Caribbean islands, Haiti and Puerto Rico, and all this kind of stuff. So as Dr. Kristen said, the economy of Cuba was very, very intimately tied to the Soviet Union because they funded it a lot. They gave it a lot of money every year. And when the Soviet Union collapsed, they lost the money. And so we know that Cuba lost 80% of its trade after the fall of the Soviet Union. 80. So they've always needed outside support to help sustain their economy. So they were hugely impacted by problems that faced the Venezuelan economy as well because of their links with that country. Many people rely on remittances. It was the second highest means of income prior to the Trump administration saying it wasn't cool for people.
What are remittances? Is that like government support?
No, it's where your family who lives abroad sends you money.
Oh, okay, got it. Thank you.
So that was the second highest means of income for people, was money that their families would send them. And we have some videos in the show notes where like one woman's talking about, or in the Google Doc, where one woman's talking about all of her clothes come from her aunt who lives in Detroit, like all of them. So that's a huge part of it. The government devalued the currency at the start of this year, and the pandemic has damaged both the health system and the tourism industry. So like I said, not great, not a great look for the economy in Cuba right now. We have they've cut a lot of the government has cut a lot of state sector jobs as a part of this reform process they've gone through since 2011. And it's opened up some retail services for self-employment and a rise of entrepreneurs, but it's still a communist state and a communist economy, and like everything has to go through the state at the end of the day. They were big on agriculture in the past, not so much now. They do a nickel mining and service industry. Obviously, coffee is a big damn deal in Cuba as well. So the economy is messy. So are the demographics. The median age is 42. Life expectancy is 79. They have universal suffrage at 16, which I thought was interesting. I was like, okay, that's early. But as we know, living in the United States and living in the world as global citizens, immigration is a continuing problem. Illegal immigration from the Cuban perspective, Cubans attempting to depart the island and enter the US via rafts, smuggling, direct flights, fake visas, big problem. We've had a surge in that in recent years after the announced normalization of US and Cuban relations in 2014, but then the Trump administration scaled that back as well. So ebbs and flows. Human rights, as is common in other communist states we've discussed, messy, not quite. I forget what the term was we had for Vietnam, but it was like, it was another not great year for human rights in Cuba as well. The government continues to repress dissident and deter public criticism. It routinely relies on arbitrary detention to harass and intimidate critics, independent activists, protesters, journalists, etc., etc., etc. The US embargo continues to provide the Cuban government with an excuse for its problems, which was really interesting perspective that I think we got from some of the videos.
Yeah.
Even the Cuban president now still says, like, it's not my fault, it's the embargo's fault.
Yeah, and so they have no motivation to like change any of these things, despite this summer was the highest rate of protests since the fall. Yeah. Since
1994, since the fall of the Soviet Union. So they've had massive protests this summer, partly because of the devaluing of the currency, the pandemic, the lack of access. Like from what I've seen from the footage, and we have a lot of videos in the Google Doc, like Cubans are just fed up with living this way. The protesting, so they were protesting a combination of restrictions on rights, scarcity of food and medicines, and the government's response to COVID. Interesting demographics in terms of women in Cuba, because they present themselves as a very equal society in terms of the communist ethos.
Right, of course, yeah.
But the patriarchy, folks. In Cuba, it's called machismo, but it's, women have made advances, but they still have to do almost all of the unpaid labor, most or all of the unpaid labor. And that's the patriarchy, that's the machismo that still says women have to conform to these restricted gender roles. They hold a high proportion in the elected representatives assembly, but they don't have a lot of power. The power is with the party, and only 7% of the Cuban Communist Party are women. So, like, you can tell me that their Congress is 50% women, but the Congress doesn't have a lot of power. As is the law everywhere. I feel like everywhere we've covered, high rates of domestic violence and intimate partner abuse, and there is no law against domestic violence in the Cuban Constitution,
or the American, for record.
For if we're comparing,
if we're keeping track.
For our LGBTQ plus folks, not great, but better than it was. After the revolution, many queer folks were incarcerated until 1979. Rounded up and incarcerated. When homosexuality was decriminalized in 79, people with HIV in the 80s were quarantined in sanitariums, which isn't great.
Okay.
They are doing a lot of public work to change the perception of LGBTQ plus rights. A lot of it is done earnestly through the work of Mariela Castro, who is the daughter of Raul Castro, niece of Fidel Castro, and her government-funded National Center for Sexual Education, which has expanded its focus to include gender and sexual minorities and fight for LGBTQ rights in Cuba. I believe from what I've seen of Mariela, she's very earnest in her desire for a lot of these things. But again, the limitations of the Communist Party on this are complicated. There's still a high prevalence of homophobia and discrimination in broader Cuban society. So
which we get into.
Go ahead. No, as we always say, there's a difference between the laws on the books and the way the culture behaves.
Yeah, and what I was going to say is that we'll talk about this a little bit more in the next video, where we cover a delightful, honestly, video of exploration of Cuban machismo and Cuban drag culture. So
such an intersection. It's an intersection we all need in our lives.
Honestly.
So let's move on to colonization, which is what brings us here today. Prior to Columbus's arrival, as we all know, the indigenous, I'm going to butcher this, y'all, but I'm going to read it. Guanayatabe, apologies, were the indigenous people who had inhabited Cuba for centuries. It's where we get the root for Guantanamo Bay from this.
Okay.
These folks. They were driven to the far west of the island. And then we had subsequent waves of immigrants, including the Taino, our beloved Taino people, and Chiboni people, migrated all over the island. And then Columbus showed up, landed in 1492, visited again in 1494, armed with the papal bull of 1493, which said that Spain had to conquer and colonize all over everywhere. Spain had to Spain everywhere, and the Pope gave them the big old seal. So they established a colony in Cuba. The coast of Cuba was not fully mapped out until 1508, but they were there for a long time. It was a long time. From 1508, real solid, all the way to the Spanish-American War and the Cuban-Spanish War. The Spanish established sugar and tobacco as the main crops. It soon became the most profitable Spanish colony in the Caribbean, but as is the problem with all these places, they didn't have enough labor. So they brought over 900,000 enslaved Africans to Cuba, more than twice the population of enslaved folks in the United States. Just 900,000 people.
I mean, that's our lesson constantly throughout this entire Colonizers World Tour, is that we had always been told that America had the most slaves, and now it's like, no, that is not true.
I don't even know if we're in the top 5 at this stage. We certainly know that Brazil and Haiti and Cuba were all worse.
Yeah, and I know Colombia wasn't great either. So
maybe someday we'll get to Colombia and find out.
In 2029, we'll finally make our way to Colombia.
So the 19th century, we saw several movements in Cuba: a reform movement, an annexation movement, and independence movements. The Cuban War of Independence started in 1895 and went to 1898 when we stepped in to help because we were so helpful at the time. We fight the Spanish in the Spanish-American War for only 4 months. We win, and the Spanish say, you can have Puerto Rico, Guam, and the Philippines. Leave us alone. So then we occupied Cuba after that to help them out in inverted commas from 1898 to 1902. But somebody, and I need to do more research on this on another time, somebody wrote into the Teller Amendment that we couldn't annex Cuba. We restricted ourselves from that unlike what we did with Guam and Puerto Rico and the Philippines. So we wanted to take Cuba, but like we couldn't.
Sure.
We had intervened 2 more times in 1906 and 1917. Eventually, we get to a young lad named Batista, who is the president of Cuba. And in the 1950s, we get a lot of people unhappy with said man Batista. And we get several groups emerging who want to make political change. By 1958, Castro's July 26th movement was the most popularly supported revolutionary group. We all know what happens here. Castro overthrows the government in 1959, establishes the communist state in Cuba. We initially supported the Castro government, but then we were like, yeah, I know. We're so fun with who we support and why. Okay. But then we weren't really happy with communism, shock in the middle of the Cold War. Yeah. And also Castro's government started executing a lot of Batista's people, and we were apparently intolerant of that. They lost $10 billion of Soviet subsidies by 1994. That's how much the Soviets were propping up the Cuban economy. $10 billion in 2 different subsidies annually. Now the Cuban government, as we talked about, an economy still in a bit of shambles. They get a lot of support from China, unsurprisingly, as well as allies in Venezuela and Bolivia. So, not a great colonial project. No disrespect to people who love Cuba and are from Cuba, but colonization has been real messy in that part of the world. $10 billion. A year was how much they got from the Soviets.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. Okay.
I love when Dr. Kristen doesn't read the history of colonization, and then I get to surprise her with things.
I'm actually starting to really love that, and I love learning along with everybody else.
Oh, it's fun. Fun times.
Okay.
Fun times here to have research. Speaking of fun times, Dr. Kristen, what's your Colonizers World Tour Jeopardy fact?
That there are islands around the island. I really had no idea.
No idea.
And I've sailed like on cruises past Cuba, because every time you're on a ship and you're passing it, they always go wave to Cuba off the. So like no one's ever told me that. Can I do a subsidiary Jeopardy fun fact? Okay.
You do however many you want.
So I'll say, because we haven't brought the Cuban people into this conversation very, very much.
Not a lot yet, no.
So I want to say that one of my other fun, kind of not even fun facts necessarily, but what I loved was this video that was made about how a bunch of Cuban gamers have gotten around the fact that they don't have unlimited internet that's easily accessible, or it's you still can't get internet in your home. It's still very expensive. You pretty much have to do it. So if you want to like play World of Warcraft or Call of Duty or any of the other kind of online games, there's this like intranet setup that's been done in Havana. Again, Camilla Cabello has led me astray as to how I say it. But as a gamer myself, I loved it. I loved this ingenuity. And then like, I just love humans that are like, hey, I know my government's doing this thing, but like, I'm going to go do this thing because you're harshing my buzz. And so like, we're going to do this thing that brings joy. And it was such a great, I've never obviously been to Cuba because I have that blue passport. And I know lots of people who have. Obviously, when we lived in the UK, Cuba is actually a very popular vacation destination.
Yeah.
And we know a lot of tourists.
Yes, so many of our friends have gone to Cuba. Yeah.
Have gone to Cuba. And at one point when, we joked that my husband was going to go by himself, get us a whole bunch of rum, and then I'd meet him in Jamaica where we both could travel together. Because my husband loves Cuban rum a lot. But it's fascinating to be reminded, and such a good reminder for us as we do this constant tour, of the incredible sameness of humanity. That it's all like, hey, we're just going to make this work. And I loved it. I loved it. There's lots of analysis in the Google Doc, by the way, about whether or not there should be tourism and what tourism could look like and how to be a responsible tourist to Cuba. There's lots of debate in the travel industry, which I appreciate. I love debate.
Yeah.
And so when we ever can, as blue passport holders, travel there, you know, hopefully we can enjoy. In the meantime, we'll keep going to this one Cuban restaurant in Hell's Kitchen that we have completely fallen in love with.
Oh my God, the food was so good.
So good. So yeah, that's mine. What is your Jeopardy fun fact for Cuba, Dr. Aaron?
I'm super excited to share it, but I wanted to say just on what you said about the gaming and we have another video as well that talks about how they get streaming content.
Yes.
And the whole ingenuity behind like providing Netflix and Hulu and all this kind of stuff to people. Like, y'all, it's such a fascinating story. And you have to work within the system you live in. And like, this as a white, I'm assuming American, was interviewing the guy who like started the gaming intranet. And he was like, yeah, the government doesn't really care as long as we don't abuse it. Like, so it's all of this, like, we can talk, until we're blue in the face of all the restrictions, but like, what does life look like on the ground? That's a different thing. And, the movie we talk about tomorrow or next up in the playlist is such a great counterbalance to this. But my Colonizers World Tour Jeopardy fact is a couple of interesting ones that I just didn't know about communist Cuba. Cubans were not allowed to buy electronic appliances before 2011.
I had heard that, I think, because of a romance novel I read. But yeah, that's wild.
It's just, so a couple of my facts are just like, what? They are not allowed to buy computers or access the internet without special authorization. And all of the internet places, if you don't have enough money to have private internet at home, they're all public spaces. And so we've got a couple videos in the Google Docs where people just take their laptops to the park because that's where the internet zone is. A lot of it has to do with state monitoring, which is not great, obviously, of folks. And my final Colonizers World Tour Jeopardy fact is that the United States government pays $4,000 a year in rent to rent Guantanamo Bay. The history of why we still have Guantanamo Bay. It's all in the Google Doc. It's a long one. But the Cuban government hasn't cashed any of the checks since the revolution. We keep paying them. I don't know where the money is. I don't know if it's literally a stack of checks or a bank account that they never touch. But like, since 1959, what are we at? Like over 70 years.
I love it.
Like, I'm doing the math real quick, y'all, because I like how much money is sitting in that bank account.
That is a commitment.
72 years times $4,000 is $288,000 US sitting in presumably a bank account that the Cuban government's like, on principle, no.
I love a petty principle. I mean, it's not petty, but like I love the like, no.
I mean, they could take some of that money and help out with the infrastructure and the roads and the food.
I mean, I'm sure it would at least build a school,
Who knows? It's not for us to say. It's not for us to say. Apparently. Yeah, but that's, for me, that was I was like, okay, Cuba, I see your snarkiness.
I see what you're doing. We see what you're doing.
Yeah.
So tomorrow, as we already mentioned, we're going to be talking about the 2016 movie Viva, which, trust us when we say it's the most Irish thing we've ever seen, spoken entirely in Cuban Spanish. Trust me, you don't want to miss the movie, which is available for free on Tubi if you want to go watch it and then come join our discussion. But definitely you don't want to miss our discussion either. So we will so in the meantime, we always forget to do this, but please do the YouTube things. Please subscribe, like, hit the bell, comment below. We love to discuss these things and we would love to hear your thoughts and comments on our thoughts and comments.
We hope to hear from you before then. If not, we'll see you for Viva.
Bye.